Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I believe some of you are meeting in person, which is something that I'm very jealous about. It's been a while since I last presented at an in-person conference. Of course, over the past 2 years, the world has changed quite dramatically, and it's really been a year out of a Quentin Tarantino movie, full of unexpected shocks and surprises, twists and turns. We've all had to become living room leaders, entering into this new era of baby Zoomers. But now, as we enter into the last quarter of 2021, and the worst of the pandemic seems to be subsiding, and we're starting to see green shoots of a recovery, there is some room for optimism, but still also a lot of uncertainty to navigate. And that's really the purpose of me being here today, is to try and help folks like you make sense of things and to help you plan ahead. So what I'm going to really do today is look at changes that have happened on three fronts: changes in the global political economy, changes on the continent and what it means, the pandemic's impact on the continent, and then lastly, look at some of the solutions and the opportunities which are making me excited. So without any further ado, I want to kick off. And, it's important to really understand the magnitude of this pandemic and how it's impacted the global political economy. We have not seen a public emergency like this since the end of World War II. We've had economic depression conditions akin to 1929. You've had a contest and a clash between liberal and authoritarian values. And you've also had the intersection of multiple crises in 2020 happening at the same time, be it economic, political, social, or environmental. You had the anti-racism protests and BLM protests that erupted in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. You've got a climate emergency, and all of these intersected at the same time. And this, for me, was a big political moment. And the last time we had something this significant was in 1989, where we had a sequence of events that changed the trajectory of the world. We had Tiananmen Square, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the release of Nelson Mandela. And this was a real inflection point in the global political economy because it marked the end of the Cold War ideology and architecture. And that set in motion three themes that persisted with us for a couple of decades, namely globalization, capitalism, and democratization, the Washington Consensus. And that persisted up until 2008, the financial crisis, when it was punctured. And then we had fiscal austerity and quantitative easing as a result of that. Now, again, it seems like in 2020, the zeitgeist has shifted. We've had another big pendulum shift, and COVID has really accelerated the themes of nationalism, isolationism, and authoritarianism. The allure of the Washington Consensus has faded, and we now seem to be in the era of bigger state, bigger debt, and more state control. So what does all this mean? And I think over here, you've got a very paradoxical role for the state in this new post-COVID era, because on the one hand, the state has been at the center of the response. It's got greater reach and relevance than before. But also we've been exposed to the shortcomings in terms of a lack of planning, poor leadership, corruption, poor governance in many countries. And I think the recognition now is that the state is both part of the problem and the solution. And I think it's really forcing a rethink of the social contract in general, because it puts the state, as I've said, at the center. And as we know, social contracts are either rejected, rewritten, or restored. So I think that's the first point. I think the global political economy and architecture has changed quite dramatically. Then we move to the second question around what does this mean for Africa? What is the impact? And again, I think the pandemic really marks an inflection point for the continent because it could be a catalyst for a sustained structural transformation, or it could see us become even more of a laggard continent. And to put it quite crudely, African states now face an existential dilemma. Can they positively disrupt themselves to govern effectively and responsibly? Or will they continue to pursue failed policies and governance models? And I think the important thing to note here is clearly the population. Africa's population is going to double by 2050, and this is creating anxiety around the sustainability of the economic trajectory, because either this is a fantastic opportunity or we are going to see extreme socioeconomic pressure unfolding. And I think what that highlights is that we have a set of choices that need to be made. And again, to put it in context, the state is going to be at the center of this, and how we navigate, I think, the following 5 relationships as an African continent is going to be critical. So number one is the economic relationship between the state and its creditors. Number two is the political relationship between the state and its citizens. Number three is the geopolitical relationship between the state and its international development partners. Four is the security relationship between the state and non-state actors. And lastly, the business relationship between the state and the private sector. And I think how we navigate these five relationships is going to be critical in determining our fortunes. I think just to take stock of where we are and where we're coming from, I think 2020 was really a terrible year for Africa. We had the first recession on the continent in 25 years. We had real and financial shocks occurring simultaneously. FDI dipped to record lows, and we were really affected by the three C's, namely COVID, commodity prices, and capital flight. And this really magnified issues for countries that were already not performing very well and exposed poor politics and poor economics. 2021 has been a bit better as we begin to recover, but now we have faced the three Ds, the debt hangover, disease, and political dysfunction. So, you know, although not as bad as last year, this year has been a bit of a mixed picture, but there is reason for optimism. The first of these is the fact that global conditions are supportive. We're starting to see signs of a global recovery. Fiscal and monetary conditions remain extremely supportive. Commodity prices, as we know, have ticked up quite significantly, and that's reflected in what African sovereigns are borrowing at in financial markets. I think in the real economy too, as global demand, especially in the US and China, recovers and we start to see more normal trade and tourism activity, this could be a boost to the continent. But of course, this is really contingent on the vaccine diplomacy story and access to vaccines. And as we know, this has been a big constraint for Africa. We are a laggard continent in this regard, which has led to allegations of vaccine apartheid. We only have 5% of the global vaccine supply administered on the continent. And we need to vaccinate 780 million people to achieve 60% herd immunity. That's going to be approximately 1.5 billion doses at a cost of $10 billion US. Most countries have put their eggs in the COVAX facility basket, but this hasn't really been effective. And that's now creating, again, more anxiety. And the West has really pursued a path of vaccine nationalism, hoarding vaccines for themselves, which is opening up the door for geopolitical competition, which I think is a really interesting space to watch. China, Russia, and India are really stepping into the void, trying to expand their soft power. And at a time where there is contestation and competition across Africa, I think this could have some seriously significant implications. So this is a space to watch quite closely to see how global powers square off on the continent and how African sovereigns manage their vaccine access to allow them to participate in the global economic recovery. Now, looking ahead, I think taken together, what does this all mean? I think it's quite clear that the continent now needs to look inwards for solutions because help coming from external partners, there's a big question mark around that. So we need to do things radically differently. And I think we need to be smart in that regard. So how we adopt smart cuts and hack the ladder, I think is going to be a critical conversation that we need to have, both as policymakers and as the private sector and amongst the folks in your space. I think quite clearly the one thing that's emerging for me as an obvious factor is the need to integrate regionally, because it's only by banding together as a collective and integrating that Africa is going to be able to achieve size, scale, and comparative advantage. This is where its resources, its population size, its innovation becomes simply too big to ignore. Otherwise, we're simply a collection of fragmented states. And I think in this context, there's some really exciting stuff happening under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. This is something I think that is simply too big to ignore. I think it prioritizes industrialization, digitization, and localization, which are all themes that have been accelerated by the pandemic. I think it could be a real catalyst, particularly for things like e-commerce, particularly for food security, for economic activity and trade, largely because we're coming off such a low base. And I think both the domestic context as well as the external context suggest that Africa now really needs to bet on itself. And I think in this regard, there are a whole bunch of opportunities which come to light. I think in particular for me, in the Technicolor economy, which comprises 5 elements: the blue economy, which is the oceans, tourism, fisheries, and aquaculture economy. We've got massive stretches of coastlines across Africa. 38 states are coastal states. We need to exploit that a lot better. The green economy goes without saying: agriculture, biggest employer on the continent. Combine that with technological advances and renewable energy, and I think that could be a real game changer. The purple economy excites me. This is the cultural, art, fashion, music economy. And over here, what we're seeing is, instead of the world, Africa going to the world is now coming to Africa. And we're seeing that in the explosion of talent in things like Burna Boy, Trevor Noah, NFTs. And I think this is a space to really watch. The flat white economy, of course, the digital economy, which is stuff that folks like you will be able to relate to, I think is quite exciting given the innovations we're seeing in places like Silicon Savannah. And then finally, the gray economy, which is the informal economy, which I think with fintech, as we begin to integrate the gray economy into the formal economy, this could create exciting opportunities as well. As you can see, a lot of complex issues for the continent to contend with. And of course, Africa is not a country, but these are common themes and trends which I think are applicable to the entire continent. I think quite obviously the issues of integration, innovation, and industrialization are going to be priorities for the African continent, policymakers, innovators, and business people alike as they chart a new future. So as we look ahead into 2022, a bit of a mixed picture, a lot of hard work and lingering issues to be resolved, but certainly some scope for optimism as well as we begin to emerge into a more normalized future. On that note, I think it would be good to end. I hope to be in attendance to your next conference next year in person. And I hope some of these insights will add value to the work that you do. So over and out from me.